Welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Andrew Schulman. I'm a program coordinator at Earthwatch, and I have the great privilege of introducing Laura Diaz and Samrat Pathania for tonight's webinar, Environmental Justice and Climate Action, Addressing Environmental Burdens and Climate Solutions through Participatory Research. Laura Diaz and Samrat Pathania are the co-founders of the Educator Collective for Environmental Justice. During this Earthwatch webinar, Laura and Samrat will describe their current environmental justice programming in 2 overburdened California communities. Attendees will also learn and engage in climate solutions lessons. They will describe action research by coalition building between academia and community through youth participatory action research and community-based participatory research. A little bit more about our webinar hosts. Laura Diaz, she/her, is the director of the Educator Collective for Environmental Justice. She is currently a Ph.D. student at UC Berkeley in environmental health sciences. Her research explores health inequities caused by disproportionate pollution exposure to vulnerable communities. She is a Science Friday Educator Collaborator, where she has published teacher materials for environmental justice curriculum, and a prior Earthwatch Fellow. She is particularly interested in the role educators play in education and awareness for environmental injustices. So welcome, Laura. Thanks for being here. Samrat Pathania, his, is a former software engineer who currently teaches mathematics, physics, and computer science at Wallkill High School in Wallkill, New York. He's a New York State Master Teacher Emeritus and a member of the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. Samrat is a passionate advocate for inquiry-based and climate solutions-centered STEM education inside and outside the classroom. He has presented many talks and workshops on practical climate solutions. He lives in New Paltz, New York, with his family in a net zero home. So welcome, Samrat. Thank you for being here as well. Without further ado, we already have the screen shared. I'll pass it over to Laura and Samrat.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So thanks for that. Like really nice introduction. I am Laura Diaz, and like was mentioned, I am an alum of an Earthwatch Fellowship, and I'm really grateful for this space and like the time to be able to share like my worldview and opinion and experience in environmental justice and like a little bit of the work that we do in our organization. Samrat, do you want to give?
No, go ahead. Yeah, I can always chime in later when we get to the climate solutions part.
Okay, cool. All right. So I think why don't we just start diving into it? And then I think a little bit of our story will probably unfold as we walk through this webinar. So please do feel free to ask questions. We will be hosting, we'll do a formal Q&A at the end of this webinar. But if there's a question that does come up that makes sense to ask in the moment, please do so. We would love to address it live and as relevant. So, okay, cool. Next slide. Okay, like I mentioned, I did an Earthwatch Fellowship in November of 2018. I am a former high school science teacher, and during that fellowship, I went to Catalina Island, and I was there with 3 other teachers. And it was one of these, what I call incubator moments, where you have an opportunity to really be inspired. Not only by the experience, but also by reflecting with other really inspirational educators. And so we were at the USC Wrigley Institute for the Environment. We were doing research alongside world-class aquanauts. We were doing water quality testing. We learned plankton classification and did some lab work at a lab that was just steps away from the ocean. It was insane. And then we went scuba diving and learned about different species of kelp and how they can be indicators for ecosystem health. And we also did population studies looking at sea lions while we were kayaking. So the experience was like, to say the least, inspiring. And I think for me, like by that time I had been teaching for quite some time, and I kind of like, I allowed myself this like 8-day block to like really immerse myself. And I found that I wanted to rededicate my priority to research and to finding these like place-based experiences for my students. And so I was like really thinking through like, how do I bring this experience like to my students, for my students, like something with this flavoring, so that they can see like the power of research questions. I think, and this is my opinion, but like science is really about asking questions and trying to find, like using the scientific method to like find answers to those questions, right? And so I was really trying to figure out how do I provide these like hands-on immersive experiences that really provide like research skills and question forming, so that my students can see themselves as scientists, right? Because like, how cool is that experience? So that was all happening, right? This was my fellowship, and on the second to last day of the fellowship, my mom called me while I was in the lab, and she was like, hey, I just want to let you know that Bella, my dog, is okay. So she had been watching my dog, and I was like, what are you talking about? And I really had been like pretty much offline. And again, this was November of 2018. And so you can go to the next slide, Samrat. And so I had no idea, like real time, that there was a fire burning in Paradise, which is the city where my mom lived at the time. And I was like in this incredibly, like what I think was like a pinnacle of like inspirational experience. And like the reality of the climate crisis like kind of really like shook me. And my mom, like, you know, quite literally survived the fire. And my mom's house is the one on the right, is the picture on the right. That's what's left of my mom's home. And so she lost her home, and quite frankly was lucky. And that campfire, there were 85 casualties, over 150,000 acres were burned, and over 18,000 structures were burned, my mom's home being one of them. And the day I flew back into San Francisco and I was waiting for my ride, I was waiting outside, and like literally the ashes of my mom's home were like falling on me. And it was, again, like this really pivotal moment for me, because again, I was in this headspace of like really questioning like my teaching practice, because I had really figured it out and was chugging along and doing okay. But I also wanted to be a little bit more inspirational, and like, instead of doing a good job getting through content, I really wanted to inspire my students to see themselves as scientists if they chose to be. And so this like really, I mean, as it would anybody, like it really was a transformational moment for me. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. And then I think also being in that headspace, I couldn't not really reflect on my own context and my own experience. And so I like, really, it was like all of this is kind of coming together at the same time. And I'm like truly like so grateful for that experience at Catalina Island with Earthwatch, because it did allow me to really see myself as a researcher, and also question like, how do I bring this into like a relevant space for my students. And so I was thinking about like my experience growing up, and I grew up in the East Bay Area of California, in Pittsburgh and Antioch, California. And in Pittsburgh, we lived about a mile away from the Dow chemical plant. And then when we moved to Antioch, when I was about 4 or 5, we were neighbors with a pretty busy freeway, which was also just on the other side of, as you can see in the picture, like this industrial corridor that is notorious for polluting. And so I couldn't, so again, I was like, okay, thinking about what happened to my mom's home and the climate crisis. And then I was thinking about where we grew up and like this issue of environmental justice. And then I realized it's probably not possible for me to bring my students to the ocean every day for them to collect water samples and have access to this like really amazing USC like laboratory right by the water, right? And that's okay. But I can figure out like the essence of that experience and maybe kind of find a way to morph all of this together, because maybe it's not just a one-stop shop, right? And so so I really started embracing I just decided like I'm going to do environmental justice and I'm going to fold it into my classroom, and I'm going to figure out ways to bring it into the classroom in ways that isn't just like a one-off like a one-day thing, where really like I folded it into every unit and they really had time to explore these issues. And so I wrote a year-long curriculum piece about environmental justice, and my students loved it. And it was so relevant, and it was something that they really wanted and like really like ran with. And after that, I really wanted to share that. And that's when I got published with Science Friday, and I shared it out there. And then I also was able to give some workshops, and that's where I met Samrat. And again, it was another one of these moments where like Samrat and I came together and we shared our teaching practice, and we were like very much on the same wavelength. And we were like, how do we create more of these like teacher incubator moments so that we can continue supporting teachers as we kind of push curriculum and innovate and like transform science education into this like really relevant, place-based and like justice-centered experience for our students that, like, in my opinion, at least for like the classes that I was teaching and the curriculum maps that I were given, like wasn't there yet. Okay, next slide. So before we like continue on, I did want to give a little bit of like nuts and bolts about like what is environmental justice, and like provide like language around like how we think about that. So environmental injustice is, quite a few things, but like one is an increased pollution burden. And so when there's more pollution burden, there's also associated health equity issues. Another environmental injustice is an issue of access, right? So is there equal access to things like clean water, right? Another environmental injustice is loss of land and resource rights. And this is something that like we have to mention, like indigenous communities in this space, right? And then another environmental injustice is, like I mentioned, for my mom's home and for all like the community in Paradise, the impacts of the climate crisis. And so climate injustice happens, like are the burdens of the climate crisis equal? Like, no, right? And so this is where I think Samrat and I are very complementary. I think about environmental justice like all the time. And his jam is climate solutions. And so it's like, it's really quite frankly, very complementary in that like I'm looking at how the injustices and what's happening, how do they manifest and how they play out, what are root causes. But then looking forward, this is like the space that Samrat really like occupies, which is like, okay, how do we get to a place that's more equitable and more just? And what are the solutions? So that's a lot of like, I mean, quite frankly, our organization really works in that space, period. Okay, next slide. Also, when talking about environmental justice, one of my favorite things to do with my students is to provide this document. So in 1991, there was a meeting of the minds for like the environmental justice activists that were really paving the way. And they wrote a document called the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. I highly recommend, like if you just quickly Google search that, you can find a PDF of that document. And I would share that document with my students, and there's 17 principles. They're really amazing. And like, we would just reflect on like, what does this mean? Like, why was this so important? I mean, it really lays out like what is environmental justice, and like, how do we get to a more just environment for all? So I wanted to share that resource. Next slide. And then also kind of to go back to what I was talking about before, when I was in the classroom, I taught AP Environmental Science, and in the textbook that I had at the time, there was only a very short paragraph that talked about environmental justice, and it was talking about dumping toxic ash in Haiti. And I think it really bothered me. It made me really mad that it was this like short paragraph. And it being a global environmental justice issue, I think allows some like removal. And my students like really saw it like in the community. And so that was something that really pushed me to do like a project-based learning class, even though it was in an AP class and there was like, we really need to get through the content. That was like one of the benefits of the Earthwatch experience of like, no, I'm really dedicated to this like immersive place-based learning. And so that really kind of pushed me to do the work that really kind of like drove us to actually start an organization that helped foster this as well. Next slide. And then kind of the last like thing I want to talk about in terms of environmental justice is environmental racism. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about like in the United States, for example, we're all consuming products from polluting industry, but we're not all bearing that burden equally. And so like this was one study, but in the middle of that graph there, we can see that Latinx Americans are exposed to 63% more pollution than we produce. And in this study, again, dependent on like the community that you're looking at. So this aggregated like Americans together, but Black Americans, 56% more pollution they're exposed to than produced. And you can see non-Hispanic white Americans are exposed to 17% less pollution than they produce. So this is very much like a racism issue that we can see depending on the issue, the context and the environment or the community. What is the root cause? And so this book, The Color of Law, is a great resource. I took some excerpts from that and shared it with my students, but it talks about redlining and how that created like generations of long-lasting segregation, and there's environmental justice issues that came from that. And another really great book is Terrible Thing to Waste by Harriet Washington, and that talks about environmental racism and how that can impact kids and their development. So I just wanted to share those resources before we kept moving on. Samrat?
Great. So thanks so much, Laura, and thanks for giving that really in-depth background of how you came to this, because I think those stories are really important. I just want to share my story a little bit, because not only are Laura and my interests complementary, our focus complementary, as in we create the whole set by having our areas of expertise. I think our lives are also complementary in a certain way, because there was Laura here in the US facing the pollution burden of an industry that her family wasn't financially benefiting from. And there I was in India benefiting financially from a polluting industry. So this is a photo of my family in the late 80s. My parents were both chemists, and my father worked for the Indian Oil Corporation, which is India's largest oil refineries, set of publicly owned oil refineries. And that's a shot of our oil refinery. And so all of my family wealth, all my education, everything was essentially sponsored by the money that we earned from this polluting industry. And really, I was completely unaware of it as I was growing up as a child. there was no conversation around who really bears the burden of the pollution. We were simply benefiting from the goods the valuables that came from this industry. So, and as Laura mentioned, the climate crisis earlier and the pollution, we know this. We know the fact that single largest source of global warming pollution is fossil fuels. And here's a curve which really shows how this has accelerated after the Second World War. And it's the same fossil fuels that are responsible for most of the pollution burden in the world. And the over 7 million people who lose their lives every year early as a consequence of pollution, they are victims of a world that is being run on fossil fuels. And it's really important to, I guess, talk about both of these pieces in our classrooms as we discuss these things, because if you look at a chemistry class, you look at a physics class, you look at a mechanical engineering class, we can't be disconnected from the science and the ethics of these industries, right? You can't just study petroleum refining in a vacuum, because it's not in a vacuum. In a mechanical engineering class, you can't just study the internal combustion engine in a vacuum. No, it has impacts on people's lives across the world. So I love to talk about these with my students in our communities and with other teachers. And I try to share, I try to change the narrative a little bit. And I want to show you a couple of graphs on how I kind of try to empower people about how can we actually make a difference as far as the climate crisis goes. And the reason being, because it's clearly very obvious. And I mean, we can talk about this graph real quickly before I give you that reason, that this is the 2020 US greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And this is usually how graphs are given to us, like, oh, the transportation is the biggest, then electricity, industry, commercial and residential is just 13%, and the rest is agriculture. Now, the reason I want to talk about this in a slightly different perspective is because, as we're already seeing with the US federal government, we are not getting climate action in this country. It seems that we cannot get our act together as a nation to really put forth bold climate legislation. So then there has to be a reframing of, okay, how do we continue attacking this problem so that we don't fall behind in terms of our emissions reduction targets? So here's this graph for the whole nation. And then this is what it looks like for New York State. I'm sorry about the quality there. New York State did not have a better resolution picture. I promise you, I searched a lot. So that's the best I could get. That's a similar story there, but in New York State, you can see that they've sort of classified this a little bit differently, and buildings are the biggest polluters because on-site fossil fuel consumption, which happens in a state like New York because of the cold weather. People burn fossil fuels to heat their homes and their buildings. That becomes the #1 cause there. But again, I think this is still not getting to the heart of how do we actually become engaged in solving this problem. And I think this picture gives us the best, in my opinion, gives us the best way of looking at that. Now, this is the American dream, right? A household. Again, the question that must be asked is, who has access to houses like this? Who has 2 cars standing in their garage that is heated and possibly cooled, right? Who has all of these bedrooms, right? That question must be asked. Who is enjoying the comforts from the polluting fossil fuel industry? And we know the answer to that, right? And this is our modern home, the American dream that is being run essentially of fossil fuels, whether it's our cars, it's our hot water, our cooking stoves, all of it, most of it, right? And this figure is one, if there's one thing I'd like you to remember from today, as far as I'm concerned, is this number, that 42% of the energy related emissions in the US come from our homes and the machines we use every day. The cars, how we heat and cool, our hot waters, washing and drying our clothes, and cooking our meals. So if we want to stay below that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, we must electrify our nation. And this is a beautiful project, Rewiring America, which I tend to use a lot in my presentations, but also with my students. We go through the white paper, we really look at it closely, and it gives them not only the technological perspective, but also the historical perspective on how did we come to where we are as far as the energy use in our country goes. So as soon as we reframe the conversation this way, that 42% is in our hands. And again, we know people who have more financial power, economic power, wealth, they are the ones who bear most responsibility for making the switch, because they actually have the financial means to start electrifying their lives. The burden is not equal there. Not every American household has the same burden of transitioning to electrification. And if we transition, then this is what it looks like. This is what it should look like. A household that runs off electricity that is generated from renewables. You've got your electric cars there. You've got those heat pump, hot water heaters, and all of that, the rooftop solar. So that's not just no longer a house of the future, that those houses are already being built in the US. And the question that we need to keep asking as we go through this transition is, how can we ensure that low-income communities, communities of colors, do get these benefits as well? Because as I'll share in a second, as we move away from fossil fuels, the average American household will save money doing that, right? And you're talking about up to $2,500 every year on energy bills. So, but if you don't have money to begin with, you can't implement those changes. So that's a question that we must not forget as we continue accelerating this move away from fossil fuels in our personal lives. Of course, if we do all of this, we're really talking about millions. Yes, the number is a few million good paying American jobs over the next 15 years. And the question of equity must always be asked there. Who gets those jobs? Where do those, which communities are benefiting from that job creation? And we know that if we make this switch to renewable energy technologies, electrical vehicle technology, then we will get those health benefits that we do crave. Then the pollution burden does move away from those communities, and we can think more clearly about where are we setting the new industries. Because irrespective of what we do, there is some level of pollution that's going to be happening. It's orders of magnitude lower, but again, we have a chance to set things right if we reset the whole energy ecosystem in our nation. Just wanted to share this beautiful picture with my students, and these are like, I love talking about a lot of these things and looking at these white papers in my classes, but I also like doing like action projects, but I really like literally action projects, right? So this was an afforestation project, a tree planting thing that happened in our community, in our town, and they asked for volunteers, and our students volunteered, and they went and planted those trees. Those trees you can see in the back, they are in these shelves to protect them from the white-tailed deer that we have in our community. And then they prepared the carbon sequestration report for that, right? So they're really learning all of those things. They're doing science literally in the world, but also learning about it theoretically in their classrooms. And I can keep going on and on about this, but I'll hand the mic back to Laura.
Okay, thanks. That's super, like, yeah, inspiring. I love seeing that. Okay, so I think like we definitely want to spend a little bit of time before we kind of open up to Q&A, talking about like how is this also manifesting in our organization. So like we took this energy of like, we want to do action work, we want to do research that's focused on environmental justice and climate solutions. And so Samrat and I spent quite a bit, like probably a year or two, like really brainstorming through like, what is this going to look like? And like, I'm very grateful for the energy and the like momentum that it's gathered. And so, okay, you can go to the next slide. So We have three like main branches to our organization. The first is our youth collective for environmental justice. And it depends, like we also, I'm a former like high school teacher and Samrat is a teacher. And so like we understand like it has to be very flexible and it has to allow for like students to come in and be able to leave and there to be varying like levels of participation. So there's that as well. But our projects like very much vary depending on what we're doing and where we're at. But so I wanted to share just one of what we're doing right now. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that I also am like really passionate about is bridging academia to community. And I think unfortunately I've seen that there's this, like really ivory tower of academia and so many layers of inaccessibility. And so now, like after having spent so much time in the classroom and like understanding how special that experience is, I want to make as much as possible like avenues and pipelines for community to engage with academics. Not to say that they aren't already, but so one of the things that we're doing is in partnership with Sonoma State University, and that school is located in Sonoma County of California. And I actually did my undergraduate degree there. And what we're doing is in collaboration with a professor there, his name is Dr. Daniel Soto, is we decided we wanted to do some air monitoring and we got a grant to do so. And so we partnered with two undergraduate students who have since graduated. One, her name is Giselle Perez Salcedo, and then there's another student, her name is Elizabeth Grossfinner. And we like all together, we decided we wanted to do some air monitoring in a community that was in Sonoma County that was overburdened with pollution and under monitored and also had increased rates of asthma. So it was like, where can we get the most bang for our buck and where would this be most useful research? And so what we found was like, so I taught the students some like geospatial analysis. And so they like together, we all created these maps and they decided that they wanted to focus on a community called Roseland, which as you can see on the map on the right is that like kind of darker brown with the dot in the center. And that's where there's more diesel pollution exposure as well as asthma prevalence. And what was really special about this is that Giselle actually grew up in that community. So there's kind of a lot of layers of this being like pretty amazing. You can go to the next slide. And like, again, like I said, there's also increased rates of asthma. So this kind of like triangle looking space under like south of where it says Santa Rosa is the Roseland community. And again, that is because it is overburdened and there's higher like pollution exposure to this community, which is also a predominantly Latino community. Next slide. So, okay, so we spent quite a bit of time deciding, like doing some analysis, deciding where to go. And so this is me in the field with the two undergraduate students. Giselle on the picture on the left-hand side, she's the one sitting down on like the left, and then Elizabeth is on the right. And we went out with the monitors. I trained them how to use the monitors. They collected data. We analyzed the data, and then we also visualized the data. So again, this was an opportunity for us to find a way to actually go out into the field, like I was saying, place-based learning, like provide those skills of like how to conduct research, and then like actually do something with it. So you can go to the next slide. And this is the data that they collected, and we did, this is quite frankly, it's just a little bit of preliminary data right now because it's an ongoing project, but they were able to collect this data like from their own monitors and analyze it. And so we did see like several spikes of interest during certain times of the day, which was actually kind of interesting because it was during midday, which we thought it would actually be during like morning and afternoon rush hour time. But then like, this is the beauty of research that actually allowed us to do some more investigating. And because there's quite a few industries there, it's because that's when there's like highest trafficking in and out of import-export of the like big trucks. And so it actually does make sense with the community and what happens there. And so we're like doing even more research there. We're actually on Friday, me, Giselle, and Dr. Soto are going to go out to that community. We're partnering with another community organization, and we're going to give a workshop to their Latinx Student Congress about this data and start a whole like youth participatory action research, so they can learn how to collect data, and then they can have actually like sustained ongoing monitoring, which they can then use for their own climate action work. So we can go to the next slide. And so they made a story map, which was amazing. And like this resource that they had, which they could share out. And then next slide. And then another really like incredible thing to see was to watch them present their findings at a conference. So like, there's just so many layers of this that is like healing and bringing in community and involving, like actually involving a student from that community to work in that community. It like is another layer of inspiration. So that's just a little bit, that's like one project that we have going in our youth collective. You can go to the next slide. The second branch that we do work in is community. And so right now we're partnering with a community health clinic called La Clínica in Pittsburgh, California, which is my hometown. And we're doing some community-based participatory research. And so they have a group of really inspiring community health workers or promotoras. And they have weekly workshops where they come to the community health clinic and they learn about different things, engage in different topics that address health equity and pollution burden. And so I was invited to give a series of environmental justice workshops. And so you can go to the next slide. And so the community health workers is a model that's used where people from the community actually like go into a clinic and like either engage in a certain topic. So sometimes it can be like topic specific, such as like reducing diabetes or increasing COVID vaccines or stuff like that. And so this is what their group was interested in looking at, environmental justice. And so that's where there was an opportunity for us to collaborate. You can go to the next slide. And what we ended up doing also, there's quite a big issue of air pollution in Pittsburgh. And so they wanted to do some air monitoring. So I trained them how to use the air monitors that we have. And they went out, collected data in locations that they were really interested in looking at. And they gave me the data, I compiled it, I analyzed it and visualized it. And then they were able to use that in their own like community action plan that they developed. And then next slide. And then as also a part of our workshop series, we had a doctor come out. This is Dr. Quiñones, who talked to the promotoras about health equity issues. And in Pittsburgh specifically, there's higher rates of heart disease and respiratory issues. And so he was talking about like kind of the nuts and bolts of those health issues and why. And so that was kind of part of that workshop series. Next slide.
And one of the things that we really like to focus on is teacher professional development, because clearly things are changing on the ground, evolving on the ground in ways that are just not making it to textbooks. They cannot make it to textbooks. So let me just looking at this one amazing research that Laura is doing with these students in California. When is it going to make it to textbooks, right? Should we wait another decade for that to happen, right? So what we try to focus on is getting teachers from different content areas together and help them understand the problem, understand the solutions, and then brainstorm ways in which they can actually bring these things into their classes. Some of the avenues that we've been working on for that is on the East Coast here, where I am in New York. New York has a New York Master Teacher Program, which is a 4-year fellowship, has about 900 teachers there. We've done summer workshops for them. We've given other presentations there, had teachers work with us. The State University of New York, New Paltz has what is called the Mid-Hudson Teacher Center. They're responsible for professional development of thousands of teachers in a few counties. So we constantly do presentations for them. And then last year in the summer, we had our first summer institute, which was very exciting. We had teachers from California and New York and a few other states like North Carolina and Washington join us. I think there was about 25 teachers. It was really exciting, where we spent 3 days really looking at the nitty-gritty of this and trying to see that how do we really start talking about these things in our classes. So just as an example, what I like to do in terms of solutions is look at some of the latest data, like look at things like Project Drawdown, which is the list of the most comprehensive solutions to the climate crisis. The 2035 report that's out of UC Berkeley about how do we get to 90% renewable energy across the country by 2035, or Rewiring America, which I quoted earlier, about how do we electrify our lives. So again, this is the latest data. And in this case, sort of complementary to Laura, I am not, my students are not collecting the data. This data has already been collected. It's been compiled by experts, and then they're really going through it and understanding so that they can take this understanding into their homes, into their communities. And so a bit of both working with the teachers and the students there. So how are we doing on time, Laura? Because I think that's our final slide.
Perfect, actually. And there's a couple of questions coming in, so this is perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, I say we start answering questions if that's okay.
Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
So the first question I see says, what kind of monitors were used? So that's a great question, because we spent a lot of time figuring out what monitors to use. And we actually decided to use purple air monitors because they are low cost. So they're between like $100 to $200, I think. And then also, like, there's such a network of purple air monitors, so you can actually download historical data. So you can do like some pretty like robust data analysis. And then the next question says, what are the types of actions communities are planning to take based on the data? Okay, this is a great question, because I think this is a potential stopping point, which I think there's this is quite a robust space for the work, which is not stopping when you're not quite sure what the answer is. So the first thing I want to say is that, particularly like for those of us who don't live in the community where we're researching, like knowing that we're not going to have the answer is the way to go, right? Because there's kind of layers of paternalism that can happen, right? And that's where I think, especially for those of us who are educators, we can really like lean into our skills as facilitators. So that's why a lot of the language is like community-based participatory research, right? Like I'm just facilitating. And so like the community is like coming up with action research. So like in Pittsburgh, for example, there was they made like a flyer with information on it. And then there's like movements such as like diesel free by 33, which is a call in California to move our whole transportation infrastructure to be diesel free by the year 2033. And there's there's other like low cost solutions, such as like Summer and I were just talking about this the other day, like making our own air monitor, our own air filters using a fan and what did you say, the MERV 13 or something?
Yeah, MERV 13 air filter.
Yeah.
Very, very ubiquitous. Yeah.
And then, okay, one of the struggles is also determining what kind of information is needed for local decision making. Yeah, I mean, you like, yeah, that is.
Can I talk a little bit about that?
Yeah,
so
please.
Like what I found here in New York is like in this terms of determining what data do you need. A good place to start can be local environmental organizations. Like we have a sense that, oh, if you have a nice name and a logo, then you must be well staffed and you've got everything under control. But that's not how most organizations are. A lot of them are really relying on volunteers to do work for them. So in New York State, we have the Climate Smart Communities, which is an initiative through New York State government, and different towns and municipalities can sign up for that, but they're almost entirely run by volunteers, and they constantly need people to come in and do work for them. And that work could be like, one of my students did his work for our town of New Paltz, was a greenhouse gas inventory, right? They needed that work done, and he was able to do that over the summer, and they were deeply appreciative of that. So I would encourage you to reach out to, if you can find organizations, environmental in your area, but even the local government, and see what do they need. They might tell you what their needs are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. And I think like also like everybody has a different way of like approaching this. And so like for me, again, I'm like very committed to research. And so I'm like, oh, monitoring. And because like as you monitor and you collect data, it kind of unfolds like a more like the real picture of what's happening. And then you can like address policy issue, like how to address policy. So right. I think the answer is like, there isn't an answer, and you don't know until you like do the research. Right. Often, or the data's out there, and like, there's just some like data mining that's needed. So there's that. There's another question. Do you have any advice for a teacher looking to develop their own curriculum on environmental justice? Yeah, for sure. So please feel free to check out, if you Google Science Friday, Laura Diaz, environmental justice, you'll find my curriculum piece. Like, please use it, because there's tons of like slides and stuff. But like, if you see that and you're like, not, that doesn't work, that's fine. I think there's like a great opportunity to fold in like data maps. So it also depends on what subject you teach, but because I was always either in like the life sciences or earth sciences, but I really liked using data maps, and that way the students would kind of like just like look at the maps and unfold a story, and without me having to say the words. So there's that. Also, please feel free to, and let me type this out as well. Please feel free to email Samrat or myself. Like, part of our work is supporting educators as they like write curriculum. Because again, like we definitely don't believe in like box curriculum. And so like every classroom is different, every like year to year it's different. We understand that, and we're happy to like help and support. So please do like reach out if that might be helpful as well.
Right. So there's one more question there. What advice do you have for young people experiencing climate grief? We might, so it's a question that I run into a lot, because I have 16, 17-year-olds in my classes, in my physics classes, and I don't hold back in terms of showing them how big the problem is, because we also the community I teach in, they're very, I think they're very insular. People are not very well informed as to the whole, extend the impact of the climate crisis. So then students do experience a lot of anxiety around that. And my approach is always that of teaching them about solutions, teaching them about people who are working on solutions, right? Connecting them to those people, because I mean, I don't think it's any different for a young person. Maybe they're a little more sensitive to it. I don't know, but I feel like I experience grief as well. And the only way I can get out of that is by taking meaningful action in the world, by feeling like I have agency. And if we just focus on the problem, then it's like you feel helpless, because it seems like it's something that cannot be solved. But if students work on, learn about solutions, feel empowered enough to talk to other people about those solutions, then it's suddenly the picture changes dramatically. Just as a quick, Laura, if I may, another example is that we have a group here in the Climate Reality Project, our Hudson Valley and Catskills chapter here in New York. One of the members, he actually works with, they created a team of students who they exclusively understand the bills and the bills that are in the New York legislation, and they push legislators on that. That's all they do. So they look at the most progressive bills as far as environmental issues are concerned, they understand them, and then they have meetings with their legislators and to push them to pass those bills. And that to me, that's absolutely incredible, right? I'm sure those students are far less likely to experience grief or anxiety than someone who's not doing that. Right?
That's cool. I think also just to like piggyback on that as well. And this also addresses like something that came up earlier too. I decided to go back to graduate school when I was like, no, this is like my life now. Like I want to spend my like professional life devoted to environmental justice. And I had a conversation with a mentor of mine, and he does like amazing work. His name is David Gonzalez, and he's at UC Berkeley. He's a postdoc at UC Berkeley. And I was like, what do we like? Okay, I know like this is the problem, and here's like, this is how we get to this, but like, what do we do? And he was like, remember like your role, and like, what are you doing in this entire puzzle piece of like what's happening? And like, he's like, because if you're a researcher and you're collecting research, like that's your job, right? And like, obviously you want like a downstream impact to be policy change, but like, that's where you get like the amazing, like Greenpeace, Communities for a Better Environment, like big wig, like environmental lawyers to like do the heavy lifting, right? Like that's not our job. And so like, I think that also really helped because I felt like I was dealing with like quite a bit of like my own kind of like issue around like I feel like I'm not doing enough, and I think it's just like really staying in it. And another thing too with the climate grief thing is like one thing that's really like an opportunity with our students is like this is such a humanity problem, and it kind of takes us away from like the teacher student role, and like it allows this dialogue for all of us to have, and it's okay to not have the answer because it's a big problem. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, students are probably going to have better answers than we do, right? So like allowing space for that, I think just shows the humanity and vulnerability that you have as an educator that I think students are like hungry for, because I think a lot of adults are having a hard time dealing with it themselves and also not knowing how to facilitate that conversation. And maybe it's just that we try, and like it's going to feel clunky sometimes and it's not going to go well, but having that space for students, I think is like so important. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you both. Laura, I'll admit I can't see the questions coming in, so I'm glad you took the reins with the Q&A. That worked.
Awesome.
That worked perfectly.
Sorry.
No, that's great. I'm glad we had some really great questions. Thank you so much for the engaging presentation. That was fantastic. Mm-hmm. For teachers who might be listening now, watching now, or for perhaps those who watch the recording, which we'll put up on our Earthwatch's YouTube channel later this week. I mean, do you have any advice, general advice for teachers on how to get involved in the Educator Collective for environmental justice? I mean, what would be a good first step?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's great because we're like right now revamping everything, which is not great timing, but but that's fine. So like please email us. So can we maybe like share it in the underneath the YouTube video? But so my email is laura.margaret.diaz@gmail.com. Yeah, awesome. And Samrat, like, yeah, go ahead. So you can email Samrat or me, please. Right. And like we're revamping our website because when we started our organization, it was only for educators, and now, as like we mentioned, there's 2 new branches, and so we're like in this transformation space. But please, yeah, email us. I think that's the best way to get a hold of us for now. Yeah, we would love to keep in touch and or support if we can.
Absolutely, yes, please do. You can see
Awesome.
the revamp happening. I've even grown my hair during this time.
That's funny. Yeah.
Excellent. That brings us to the hour. So we filled this hour perfectly. I think with that, we'll just say thank you again. I hope this has been an informative webinar for our educator alumni and wider Earthwatch community. Thank you to Laura and to Samrat for giving us your time so generously, and again for the engaging presentation. I really appreciate it. We at Earthwatch really appreciate it. With that, we'll end the recording.
Awesome.
Thanks so much. Thank you for giving us the platform.
Yeah.
No, of course, of course.
Ditto.